The English Channel is a miserable stretch of water even on a good day. On the morning of June 6, 1944, it was a churning, freezing meat grinder. Picture 36 seasick American boys crammed into a flat-bottomed Higgins boat made of plywood, bouncing through swells at 50 degrees Fahrenheit, smelling of diesel exhaust, salt spray, and fear. They are carrying 80 pounds of gear, heading toward a shoreline, bristling with concrete bunkers, layered barbed wire, and millions of mines. We all know the history book version of this day. The ramps drop, the machine guns open up, the blood stains the sand at Omaha and Utah beaches, but ultimately American grit prevails, the cliffs are scaled, the beachhead is secured, and the liberation of Europe begins. But what if it did not happen that way? What if the greatest amphibious invasion in human history was a catastrophic, bloody failure? What happens when the greatest industrial military machine on Earth throws its absolute best punch and misses completely? Before we wargame this doomsday scenario and tear apart the tactical map of a failed Operation Overlord, take a sec to hit that subscribe button and leave a comment below letting me know which historical battle you want us to analyze next. We are diving deep into the grim mathematics of war on this channel, and your support keeps the analytical ammunition flowing. To truly understand the nightmare scenario of a failed D-Day, we have to strip away the Hollywood mythology and look at the cold, hard strategic reality that led to that morning. The pressure on the Allied High Command was not just tactical, it was existential. By early 1944, Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Red Army had been bleeding the German Wehrmacht white on the Eastern Front for 3 years. Stalin was relentlessly demanding a second front in Western Europe to relieve the crushing pressure on his forces. If the United States and Britain failed to establish a permanent foothold in France, the geopolitical consequences were terrifying. Either the Soviet Union might collapse under a renewed German offensive, or, perhaps worse for the West, Stalin might sign a separate, secret peace treaty with Adolf Hitler, just as he had in 1939. This would free up millions of battle-hardened German soldiers to pivot entirely to the dimtint of Fortress Europe. The stakes were not just the liberation of France, but the survival of the free world. The American way of war in the 1940s was built on a foundation of overwhelming industrial logistics, a concept often referred to as the arsenal of democracy. The United States was outproducing the Axis powers in every conceivable metric. We were churning out Liberty ships faster than German U-boats could sink them, and mass-producing the M4 Sherman tank, which, while outgunned by German heavy armor, was mechanically reliable and available in staggering numbers. But having a mountain of supplies in Detroit or New York means absolutely nothing if you cannot deliver it to the tip of the spear in Normandy. The logistical buildup in Great Britain, known as Operation Overlord, was a miracle of modern military planning. The island of Britain was practically sinking under the weight of American men, munitions, rations, and fuel. Over 2 million troops were staged in the United Kingdom, alongside millions of tons of supplies. But this massive concentration of force was a ticking clock. You cannot keep an invasion force of that size coiled up indefinitely. The logistical strain on Britain, the plummeting morale of idle troops, and the impossibility of keeping a secret of that magnitude hidden from German intelligence meant that 1944 was a use it or lose it moment for General Dwight D. Eisenhower. We also have to look at the historical precedents that were haunting the Allied commanders. Amphibious assaults against fortified positions are the single most difficult military operation to execute. Winston Churchill was absolutely tormented by the ghost of Gallipoli. Back in 1915, during the First World War, the British and French attempted a massive amphibious landing on the Gallipoli Peninsula against the Ottoman Empire. It was a strategic disaster, resulting in hundreds of thousands of casualties and a humiliating withdrawal. The Allies had also learned a brutal, bloody lesson much more recently in August 1942 at Dieppe, where a primarily Canadian force attempted a raid on the French coast. They were slaughtered on the pebble beaches, pinned down by interlocking fields of German fire, proving that capturing a fortified port was tactical suicide. Meanwhile, in the Pacific Theater, the United States Marine Corps had just paid a horrendous toll in November 1943 at the Battle of Tarawa. The Marines learned the hard way that naval bombardment often fails to destroy deeply dug-in concrete bunkers, and that getting stuck on a reef or a sandbar under heavy machine gun fire turns an assault into a massacre. Eisenhower, General Omar Bradley, and British General Bernard Montgomery knew these precedents intimately. They knew that a landing on the beaches of Normandy was a massive gamble, relying on a fragile chain of perfect timing, weather, and overwhelming fire superiority. Now let us look across the English Channel at the German war machine waiting in the bunkers. The German defensive doctrine in the West was a massive point of contention between two of their top commanders, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt and Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. Rundstedt, the old Prussian aristocrat, believed that the Atlantic Wall was a propaganda myth. He knew you could not fortify thousands of miles of coastline against an enemy with absolute naval and air supremacy. His doctrine was based on elastic defense. He wanted to hold the elite Panzer divisions, the heavy armor, well inland, out of range of the devastating 16-inch guns of the American and British battleships. Rundstedt's plan was to let the Allies land, let them get bogged down, and then launch a massive, concentrated armored counterattack to crush the invasion force against the sea. Rommel, the Desert Fox, completely disagreed, and his logic was forged in the bitter fires of North Africa, where he had been heavily bombed by American and British aircraft. Rommel understood the reality of Allied air superiority. He knew that if the Panzer divisions were held inland, they would be blown to pieces by American P-47 Thunderbolts and British Typhoons before they ever reached the beaches. Rommel argued that the invasion had to be stopped at the water's edge in the first 24 hours. He wanted the Panzer divisions positioned right behind the beaches, ready to counterattack immediately while the Americans were still disorganized and fighting in the surf. Adolf Hitler, in his typical fashion of micromanaging and dividing his generals, chose a disastrous compromise. He gave Rommel control of some coastal defense divisions, but kept the elite mechanized reserves, including the 12th SS Panzer Division and the Panzer Lehr Division, under his own personal control. This meant that on the morning of the invasion, the German armor was paralyzed, waiting for a phone call from a sleeping dictator in Berchtesgaden. But even without the immediate armored counterattack, the static defenses of the Atlantic Wall were formidable. Rommel had spent months turning the Normandy coastline into a fortress of death. He planted millions of landmines, both anti-tank teller mines and anti-personnel bounding mines. He ordered the installation of massive steel obstacles in the surf zone, known as Czech hedgehogs and Belgian gates, designed to rip the bottoms out of the American landing craft at high tide. Behind the beaches, the terrain itself was a weapon. The Norman bocage, a network of ancient, dense hedgerows, essentially turned every single farm field into a natural anti-tank, trench, and infantry fortress. Let us zoom in on the specific correlation of forces at Omaha Beach, the sector that would become the crucible of our doomsday scenario. The American assault force here consisted of the veteran 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, and the untested 29th Infantry Division. They were facing the German 352nd Infantry Division. Allied intelligence had drastically underestimated the presence of the 352nd. They thought the beach was defended by a second-rate coastal defense unit composed of older men and conscripted prisoners of war. Instead, they were walking into the crosshairs of a battle-hardened, fully equipped combat division with experienced officers who had survived the meat grinder of the Russian front. The weapons mismatch at the squad level in a static defensive scenario is crucial to understand. The standard American infantryman carried the M1 Garand, a brilliant semi-automatic rifle firing a .30 caliber round from an 8-round N-block clip. It was the best infantry rifle of the war, giving the American soldier superior individual firepower. But in an amphibious assault, individual rifles are nearly useless against concrete pillboxes. The German defensive doctrine was built entirely around the general-purpose machine gun, specifically the terrifying MG42. This weapon fired a 7.92mm Mauser cartridge at an astonishing cyclic rate of up to 1,200 rounds per minute. It was nicknamed Hitler's Buzzsaw because the human ear could not distinguish individual gunshots. It just sounded like ripping canvas. placed in interlocking fields of fire inside concrete bunkers known as Widerstandsnests or resistance nests. A single MG-42 crew could annihilate an entire company of American infantry struggling through the waist-deep water. Furthermore, the Germans possessed the dreaded 88mm flak gun, originally designed as an anti-aircraft weapon but repurposed as the most lethal anti-tank gun of the war. Firing a high-velocity armor-piercing shell, the 88 could punch through the frontal armor of an American Sherman tank from over a mile away. The Sherman, while fast and reliable, had relatively thin armor, about 2 inches on the front hull, and mounted a low-velocity 75mm gun that struggled to penetrate German armor or reinforced concrete at long ranges. The American reliance on naval gunfire and aerial bombardment to soften up these defenses before the landing craft arrived was the linchpin of the entire operation. So what happens when that linchpin snaps? Do you really think a few thousand airborne troops scattered across the Norman countryside in the dark could hold off 3 mechanized divisions without immediate reinforcement from the beaches? The answer is a resounding no. The entire Allied operational plan was a house of cards that relied on momentum. If the men on the beaches could not punch through the seawall, secure the draws leading inland, and establish a perimeter for the follow-on forces and heavy equipment to land, the invasion would collapse under its own weight. The logistics required to sustain the beachhead were staggering. The Allies needed to land thousands of tons of ammunition, medical supplies, and fuel every single day just to keep the troops fighting. They planned to build artificial harbors known as mulberries to handle this massive tonnage, but these required a secured beach and relatively calm weather to assemble. Imagine the strategic nightmare if the morning of June 6 goes terribly wrong. The heavy bombers, flying blind through thick cloud cover, delay their release by just a few seconds to avoid hitting the landing craft, dropping thousands of tons of high explosives harmlessly into the French cow pastures miles inland. The naval bombardment, firing through the fog and smoke, fails to neutralize the reinforced concrete bunkers. The Higgins boats, fighting strong lateral currents, drift miles off their designated sectors, mixing up units and destroying the tactical command structure before a single boot hits the sand. And waiting for them, completely unscathed, is the full fury of the German 352nd Infantry Division, their MG-42s loaded, their artillery pre-sighted on the exact tidal lines where the American ramps are about to drop. The stage is set for a massacre of unprecedented proportions, a tactical failure that would not just leave thousands of Americans dead in the water, but could alter the entire trajectory of the 20th century. To understand exactly how this slaughter unfolds, and how the collapse of the beachhead triggers a catastrophic chain reaction across the entire European theater, we have to look at the precise moment the operational plan disintegrates under the withering fire of the Atlantic Wall. The ramps of the LCVP Higgins boats drop at exactly 0630 hours, and the theoretical planning of Operation Overlord instantly collides with the brutal kinetic reality of German ballistics. The Higgins boat is a marvel of American mass production, designed to deliver 36 fully equipped infantrymen directly onto a hostile shore. But we need to look at the material science of this vessel. It is constructed primarily of 3/4-inch marine plywood. Against the freezing spray of the English Channel, it is perfectly adequate. Against a 7.92mm armor-piercing round fired from a German MG-42 machine gun, marine plywood offers the exact same ballistic protection as a wet cardboard box. As the ramps splash down into the surf at Omaha Beach, the men of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions are not stepping out into a chaotic, suppressed battlefield. In this nightmare scenario, the naval bombardment and aerial bombing have completely missed the coastal defenses. The men are stepping into a perfectly calibrated, pre-sighted kill zone. To understand the geometry of this slaughter, you have to look at the German defensive layout, specifically at Widerstandsnest 62, or WN62, overlooking the Colville Draw. The German doctrine did not place their machine guns facing directly out to sea. That is a Hollywood myth. They placed them in enfilade, meaning the guns were angled to fire down the length of the beach, creating interlocking fields of crossfire. A single German gunner, like the infamous Heinrich Severloh, sitting inside a concrete pillbox with an MG-42, is not aiming at individual soldiers. He is firing a continuous stream of lead at 1,200 rounds per minute across a tidal flat packed shoulder to shoulder with thousands of Americans. The cyclic rate is so high that the barrel of the machine gun has to be swapped out every 250 rounds to prevent it from melting, a process a trained German crew can execute in under 6 seconds. The American troops, weighed down by 80 pounds of waterlogged wool uniforms, ammunition, and radios, are trying to wade through waist-deep water while being hit by a buzzsaw of concentrated fire. Where is the American armor that was supposed to provide mobile cover? The plan called for the deployment of duplex drive, or DD, Sherman tanks. This was a brilliant piece of engineering on paper, taking a 30-ton medium tank and wrapping it in a collapsible canvas screen, using the tank's engine to power twin propellers. But the English Channel on June 6th is churning with 6-foot swells. The DD tanks are launched from their LCT motherships 3 miles offshore. The canvas skirts are designed to withstand a maximum of 1 foot of freeboard. As the freezing salt water pours over the struts, the canvas collapses. The tanks do not just sink, they plummet to the bottom of the channel like massive iron anvils, taking their crews down into the dark, 50-degree water. Out of 32 DD tanks destined for Omaha Beach, 27 are lost in the swells. The infantry on the sand is left completely naked, stripped of the 75mm mobile artillery that was supposed to blow the German pillboxes wide open. How do you cross 300 yards of open, flat sand with zero cover, zero armor support, and zero concealment, while being targeted by weapons designed to rip aircraft out of the sky? You do not. You die in the surf. The survivors who manage to crawl out of the red-stained water find themselves pinned against the shingle, a bank of smooth, fist-sized stones marking the high tide line. But the shingle is a death trap. It provides concealment from direct line of sight, but no cover from plunging fire. This is where the German artillery begins to systematically dismantle the American beachhead. The German 352nd Infantry Division has pre-registered every single inch of that beach with their 81mm and 120mm mortars. But the real terror comes from the Nebelwerfer 41. This is a towed, 6-barreled multiple rocket launcher firing 150mm high-explosive rockets. The Americans called it the Screaming Mimi because of the terrifying, unearthly howl the rockets made in flight. When a Nebelwerfer barrage impacts the shingle, the explosions does not just kill with a shrapnel and blast pressure. The concussive force turns the millions of smooth stones on the beach into high-velocity secondary projectiles. The shingle itself becomes a fragmentation grenade, shredding the pinned-down American infantry. As the morning progresses, the situation deteriorates from a tactical crisis into a strategic catastrophe. The tide is coming in, rising at an astonishing rate of 1 inch every minute. The beach is shrinking. The wounded, unable to drag themselves up the sand, are drowning in the surf. The massive steel beach obstacles, the Czech hedgehogs and Belgian gates, which the combat engineers were supposed to blow up at low tide, are now submerged. They become lethal underwater traps for the second and third waves of landing craft. Higgins' boats impale themselves on the hidden steel beams, detonating the teller mines strapped to the obstacles, instantly vaporizing the boats and the 36 men inside. The shoreline becomes a chaotic, burning graveyard of American industry, choked with shattered plywood, burning diesel fuel, and shattered bodies. General Omar Bradley, commanding the American First Army from the bridge of the heavy cruiser USS Augusta, is staring through his binoculars at a wall of smoke and fire. In our timeline, a few brave junior officers and non-commissioned officers managed to blow gaps in the barbed wire and led small, desperate charges up the bluffs. But in this failed scenario, those men are killed in the opening minutes. The command structure on the beach is entirely decapitated. Radios are destroyed by saltwater or shrapnel. Bradley has no communication with his forward elements. He is blind. The only thing he knows is that the beachhead is not moving forward, and the casualty reports coming from the returning landing craft are apocalyptic. We have to compare this localized slaughter to historical disasters of similar magnitude. This is not just a bad day at the office. This is the Union Army at the Battle of Fredericksburg in 1862, marching across an open plain into the concentrated artillery and rifle fire of Marye's Heights, resulting in a senseless, bloody massacre. Or worse, it is the Roman legions at Cannae, packed so tightly together by the enemy that they cannot even raise their weapons to fight back, waiting to be systematically butchered. The Americans on Omaha and Utah beaches are trapped in a modern mechanized Cannae, with the English Channel serving as the anvil and the Atlantic Wall as the hammer. While the beaches run red, a completely different, yet equally disastrous nightmare is unfolding a few miles inland for the American Airborne forces. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were dropped in the middle of the night to secure the causeways leading off the beaches and to prevent German reinforcements from reaching the coast. But the drop was a chaotic mess. C-47 Skytrain pilots, flying through dense cloud cover and heavy German anti-aircraft fire, panicked and broke formation. Instead of dropping at the optimal speed of 90 miles per hour at 800 feet, many pilots throttled up to 150 miles per hour and dropped to 400 feet. When a paratrooper hits the slipstream at that speed, the shock of the opening parachute can rip his equipment bags right off his body or tear his shoulder out of its socket. Thousands of elite American paratroopers land scattered across hundreds of square miles of the Norman bocage, completely disorganized, missing their heavy weapons, and separated from their commands and structures. Furthermore, the brilliant German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had ordered the low-lying fields behind Utah Beach to be flooded by opening the river locks. Hundreds of American paratroopers, weighed down by up to 100 pounds of gear and parachute silk, land in 3 feet of swamp water in the pitch black and silently drown before they can even draw their trench knives to cut their harnesses. Those who survive the drop and manage to link up face an insurmountable tactical problem. They are light infantry. Their primary anti-tank weapon is the M9 bazooka, firing a 36-inch shaped charge. It is a fantastic weapon against a German half-track or a supply truck. But by midday on June 6, the paralysis in the German high command finally breaks. In this timeline, Adolf Hitler wakes up early, or perhaps Rundstedt simply ignores protocol and releases the armored reserves immediately. The 21st Panzer Division, stationed just southeast of Cannes, and the elite 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend begin their engines and roll toward the coast. Let us analyze the terrifying reality of a German armored counterattack hitting unsupported light infantry. The Panzerkampfwagen IV, the workhorse of the German armored forces, boasts 80 mm of frontal armor and mounts a high-velocity 75 mm gun. The American bazooka round simply cannot penetrate the front glacis plate of a Panzer IV. The paratrooper has to maneuver through the dense, blinding hedgerows to get a 90-degree shot at the thinner side or rear armor, a nearly impossible task when the tanks are supported by veteran German Panzer grenadiers armed with MP-40 submachine guns and STG-44 assault rifles. But the Panzer IV is not the only monster waking up. The Panzerlehr Division is moving up, equipped with the Panzerkampfwagen V, the legendary Panther tank. Weighing 45 tons, with heavily sloped frontal armor that bounces Allied anti-tank rounds like ping-pong balls, the Panther mounts the devastating 75 mm L-70 gun. This weapon fires an armor-piercing projectile at over 3,000 feet per second. It can punch straight through a brick farmhouse, vaporize the paratroopers hiding inside, and keep going. The American airborne forces, running out of .30 caliber ammunition, lacking artillery support, and facing a coordinated, mechanized assault, are slowly compressed into isolated pockets of resistance. They are fighting the equivalent of the British airborne disaster at Operation Market Garden in Arnhem, but on a massive theater-wide scale. Back on the coast, the United States Navy attempts a desperate intervention. Destroyers like the USS Samek and the USS Frankfurt risk running aground, steaming dangerously close to the shore to provide direct fire support with their 5-inch guns. They are trying to blast the concrete pillboxes at point-blank range. But Rommel anticipated this. The waters off Normandy are heavily seeded with Kriegsmarine-influenced mines, magnetic and acoustic naval mines that detonate without physical contact. In this failed scenario, a destroyer strikes a magnetic mine. The explosion breaks the ship's keel in half, sending a massive fireball into the sky and showering the trapped infantry on the beach with burning debris. Seeing the loss of a multi-million-dollar warship, the naval commanders are forced to pull the fleet back to deeper water, out of effective range. The infantry is now truly and completely abandoned on the sand. By 1500 hours, the situation is terminal. The German 352nd Infantry Division has not run out of ammunition. They have rotated their machine gun barrels, resupplied their mortar pits from deep underground bunkers, and continue to pour a relentless volume of fire into the shrinking American perimeter. The causeways leading inland, the only exits off the beach, are firmly plugged by elements of the German 915th Grenadier Regiment. The American beachhead is no longer an invasion force. It is a hostage situation. General Bradley, facing the absolute destruction of 2 entire infantry divisions, is forced to make the most agonizing decision in the history of the United States military. He reaches for his radio to transmit the code word for evacuation, a logistical impossibility that will require pulling shattered men off a burning beach under the guns of a victorious, heavily armored enemy. The order to evacuate a shattered amphibious force under heavy enemy fire is not a tactical maneuver, it is a logistical death sentence. When General Omar Bradley transmits the abort code to the fleet, he is asking for the impossible. You cannot simply throw a massive, complex amphibious invasion into reverse. The shallow draft Higgins boats and the larger landing craft tank vessels that survived the initial slaughter are now ordered to turn around and head back into a literal wall of high explosives. The German artillery commanders on the bluffs, realizing the Americans are attempting to pull out, do not cease fire to let them go. They double their rate of fire. The 88mm flat guns are wheeled right up to the cliff edges, firing down into the water with devastating, flat-trajectory, armor-piercing shells. They are shooting at unarmored, slow-moving plywood boats packed to the brim with wounded, terrified teenagers. The English Channel becomes a burning lake of diesel fuel, floating debris, and shattered American hardware. To understand the sheer horror of this withdrawal, we have to look at the darkest chapters of American military history. This is not Dunkirk, where the British Expeditionary Force had a functional port, a massive civilian flotilla, and a relatively static perimeter. This is the fall of Bataan in 1942, but condensed into a few agonizing hours, where tens of thousands of American troops are simply abandoned to their fate because the naval extraction capability has been completely annihilated. The men left on the beaches of Normandy, out of ammunition, their radios dead, their officers killed, have only 2 options left. They can drown in the rising tide, or they can raise their hands and surrender to the very SS and Wehrmacht units they were sent to destroy. By nightfall on June 6th, the Atlantic Wall has held, and the greatest military armada ever assembled has been broken into pieces. So why did the tactical doctrine fail so spectacularly? The harsh strategic lesson here is the absolute fallacy of relying on preliminary bombardment to neutralize deeply entrenched, reinforced concrete fortifications. The United States Navy brought massive firepower to the fight, including the venerable battleship USS Texas, firing 14-inch high-explosive shells. But we must analyze the ballistics. A 14-inch naval shell fired from miles offshore has a relatively flat trajectory. It is designed to punch through the vertical armor belt of an enemy battleship. When fired at a coastal bluff, these massive shells either slammed harmlessly into the thick earthen banks below the bunkers or skipped right over the top of the cliffs, detonating miles inland in empty cow pastures. The Americans needed plunging fire, the kind of high-angle artillery that drops straight down onto a target, but they simply did not have the right tools in the right place. Firepower does not equal suppression if the enemy is sitting inside 10 feet of reinforced concrete, waiting for the barrage to lift. Then we have the catastrophic failure of military intelligence. How does the most sophisticated intelligence apparatus on the planet completely miss the movement of an entire battle-hardened German division? The Allies had cracked the German Enigma code, a secret known as ULTR. They were reading the mail of the German High Command, but they became overly reliant on signals intelligence, or SIGINT. The German 352nd Infantry Division moved into the Omaha beach sector under the cover of darkness, maintaining strict radio silence using landlines and physical couriers for communication. Because the Allies heard nothing on the radio, they assumed nothing had changed. They ignored the scattered reports from the French resistance, the human intelligence on the ground, because it did not match their high-tech intercepts. This is a fatal flaw in military planning that has haunted commanders for centuries. You can have all the intercepted codes in the world, but if you do not have a man in the mud with binoculars confirming the enemy's position, you are flying blind. Let us pivot to the geopolitical and political shockwaves, because a failed D-Day does not just stay in Normandy, it shatters the entire global strategy of the Allied powers. Do you really think the American public, reading the morning newspapers on June 7, would just shrug off the loss of 50,000 to 100,000 in casualties in a single day? The psychological impact would be apocalyptic. We have to compare this to the Tet Offensive in Vietnam in 1968. Tactically, the United States military decimated the Viet Cong during Tet, but psychologically, the sheer scale and surprise of the offensive broke the political will of the American public to continue the war. A failed D-Day would be a tactical massacre and a psychological atomic bomb rolled into one. In November 1944, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt is up for an unprecedented fourth term in the White House, running against the Republican challenger, Thomas E. Dewey. In our timeline, the successful liberation of Paris guaranteed FDR's re-election. But in this nightmare scenario, Roosevelt is the architect of the greatest military disaster in American history. The isolationist wing of the American political spectrum would surge. Dewey could campaign on the promise of pivoting the entire American war machine away from the European bloodbath and focusing solely on the Pacific theater to crush the Japanese Empire and avenge Pearl Harbor. The alliance between the United States and Great Britain would fracture under the weight of mutual recriminations. Winston Churchill, who had always been skeptical of a cross-channel invasion, would almost certainly face a vote of no confidence in Parliament, potentially collapsing the British War Cabinet. The economic and logistical ramifications are equally terrifying. The arsenal of democracy is a massive machine, but it is not magic. The Allies lost thousands of landing craft, hundreds of tanks, and massive stockpiles of weapons in the surf of Normandy. You cannot replace 500 specialized LST landing ships in a month. It takes a year of round-the-clock shipyard production, assuming the steel and labor are even available. The invasion of Europe would have to be delayed until at least the summer of 1945 or perhaps 1946. But time was the one resource the Allies did not have, because the technological landscape of the war was shifting rapidly. A delay of 1 or 2 years gives Nazi Germany the breathing room to fully deploy their Wunderwaffen, their wonder weapons. By late 1944, the Germans were already launching the V-1 flying bomb and the V-2 ballistics missile at London. The V-2 is a weapon against which there is absolutely no defense. It drops from the edge of space at supersonic speeds. Without Allied troops overrunning the launch sites in France and the Low Countries, Hitler could rain thousands of V-2 rockets onto British cities, ports, and staging areas indefinitely, turning southern England into a permanent, unlivable crater. Furthermore, the skies over Europe would turn decidedly against the American heavy bombers. The Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, was entering production. Flying at over 500 miles per hour, the Me-262 could slice through formations of American B-17 flying fortresses before the gunners could even traverse their turrets. If Germany had another year to mass-produce these jet fighters and train pilots, the American daylight bombing campaign over Germany would become mathematically unsustainable. The mighty 8th Air Force would be bled white, and the skies over the Reich would belong to the Luftwaffe once again. But the most chilling geopolitical consequence of a failed D-Day involves the Soviet Union. Joseph Stalin is watching this disaster unfold from Moscow. Operation Bagration, the massive Soviet summer offensive, is about to kick off. If Stalin sees that the Americans and British have been decisively thrown back into the sea, he realizes he is fighting the bulk of the Wehrmacht completely alone. Does he continue to bleed his Red Army dry to march on Berlin? Or does he look at the map, realize the West is paralyzed, and reach out to Berlin to negotiate a second Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact? If the Soviets and the Germans sign a ceasefire in the East, Hitler can transfer 3 million battle-hardened veterans, thousands of Tiger and Panther tanks, and massive artillery parks to the Atlantic Wall. Fortress Europe would become truly impenetrable. Alternatively, if Stalin decides to keep fighting and eventually breaks the back of the German army on his own, the Red Army does not stop at the Elbe River. Without an American and British presence in Western Europe to check Soviet expansion, Soviet tanks would roll through Berlin, through Paris, and all the way to the coast of the English Channel. The Iron Curtain would not divide Germany, it would divide the Atlantic Ocean. The entire continent of Europe would fall under the totalitarian grip of the Soviet Union, fundamentally altering the Cold War before it even began. The United States would be left as an isolated fortress in the Western Hemisphere, facing a monolithic communist superstate across the Atlantic. The only trump card left in the American arsenal would be the Manhattan Project. By August 1945, the United States would possess the atomic bomb. In a timeline where the invasion of Europe has failed and the war is dragging into 1946, it is highly probable that President Harry Truman would order the atomic bombing of Berlin, Frankfurt, or Munich. But delivering a massive, heavy atomic weapon deep into German airspace, defended by swarms of Mi-262 jet fighters and advanced radar-guided flak, would be a nearly impossible mission for a conventional bomber. The world might have witnessed a nuclear exchange in Europe, leaving the continent a radioactive wasteland, rather than a liberated democracy. The failure of Operation Overlord is not just a tactical thought experiment. It is a stark reminder of the razor-thin margin between the world we know and a dystopian nightmare. The men who bled and died on those beaches did not just secure a strip of sand, they held the door open for the survival of Western civilization. When you look at the sheer mathematics of the Atlantic Wall, the logistical nightmares, and the terrifying technological advancements of the German war machine, the true miracle of D-Day is not just that it succeeded, but that it was ever attempted at all. History is rarely decided by the grand speeches of politicians. It is written in the blood, the mud, and the terrifying split-second decisions of young men thrown into the meat grinder of industrialized warfare. If you want to understand the true cost of freedom, you have to look into the abyss of what would have happened if we had lost. Now I want to hear from you in the comments section below. If D-Day had failed and the invasion of Europe was delayed by 2 years, which German wonder weapon would have been the biggest threat to the Allies? A. The V-2 ballistic missile raining down on London. B. The Mi-262 jet fighter destroying the American bomber fleets. C. The Type XI U-boat completely severing the Atlantic supply lines. Drop your vote and your reasoning in the comments, and I will see you on the next battlefield.